straight on to our second speaker, and that's Fanie Rautenbach. As I mentioned, Fanie is a key person in LepiMAP and the Virtual Museum, as he does most of the identifications for the Virtual Museum LepiMAP. And Fanie has been looking at the data that has been submitted to LepiMAP, and he's come up with some very interesting initiatives with regard to some of the less reported species in LepiMAP. Fanie, I'd like to hand over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Rick. I'll just share my screen. Can everybody see my presentation?
Excellent. Can see it? There we go. Perfect. Thanks.
So, thanks, Rick. Before I talk about the LepiMAP challenge, I just want to kind of give a bit of background on the LepiMAP itself and where we are sitting in terms of the data. And it specifically pertains to the three Southern African countries, which is South Africa, Lesotho, and eSwatini. So the LepiMAP started in 2007 with photo submissions. And since then, we have now reached about 123,000 identified photos since that time. So in the 13 years, 123,000 identified photo records from South Africa, Lesotho, and eSwatini. Apart from the photo records, there are also, I'm going to call them the historical records. It is records that doesn't have any photos attached to them, but they are records that came from collectors from all the previous big names in Lepidochrysops in South Africa, who collected specimens over the years. And that data was put into the LepiMAP also around 2007, and it became part of the database. And those records, it numbers an incredible 333,000 records, and it actually dates back to as long ago as 1850. On the Virtual Museum, the historical records were last updated in 2007. So we do have a bit of a gap there, that for the last 13 years, the non-photo records or the collectors' records, mostly from LepSoc members, have not been included in the LepiMAP database. As I said, those records date back as long ago as 1850. I think there's even a few records that are earlier as that. And those records actually came from a guy called Roland Trimmen, who did a lot of work on South African species in the 1800s. I've put up this photo. There's obviously, because he did so many work on species in South Africa, butterfly species, there's a lot of species that contains his name. This is Lepidochrysops trimmeni, the dark giant cupid. It still flies today on the Cape Peninsula. I took these two photos. It's the female on the top left corner and the male on the bottom right. And it's such a privilege to still see these species fly on the Cape Peninsula today. So what is the LepiMAP challenge about? So I went through the data for South Africa, Lesotho, and eSwatini, and I'm specifically referring to the 123,000 photo records. And what I found was that of the just a little bit more than 800 species and subspecies that the three countries share, that we do not, there's no photos for about 112 of these species or subspecies. And then there's a further 168 for which we have no photos since the start of 2015. So of the just over 800 species and subspecies, we have no photos over the last 13 years for 112 of those species. So what I did was, and I did that in conjunction with Les, is that I pulled up a list in Excel where I've listed these 112 species with the species name, the last recorded date, the province where they are normally found, and then localities. It's not specific localities, it's more general localities. And the idea behind the LepiMAP challenge is that I want to encourage citizen scientists to see if they can't find these species and get us a photograph of them and then submit it to the LepiMAP. So this list in Excel, I think Les will make it available on the BDI website. He will, it's actually already there on the BDI website. So you can go and have a look at the list, and you can see if there's any species maybe in your province that we don't have a photo of, and see if you can't go and find it. Now, I know that a guy like Steve will tell me that this is not an easy feat. I think there's even species that he hasn't got photos of in all his years of traveling throughout South Africa. There's certainly ones that are very difficult to find. So I can't go through all 112 photos of species in this presentation, but I will highlight a few and I will explain why they are so tricky to find. This is just a summary of if you look now at the South African map, and I've listed there the amount of species for which we don't have photos for each province. So for Limpopo, for example, there's 37 species, Mpumalanga, 30 species, Gauteng 9, Northwest 7, eSwatini 7, Lesotho is 8, Free State 9, KwaZulu-Natal is 28, Eastern Cape 31, Northern Cape 30 species, and then the province that I lived in, I was probably a little bit shocked that the Western Cape had the most species for which we have no photos, and it's a total of 53. So you will see that that adds up to more than the number of species that I listed, because there are obviously species that covers that flies in more than one province. So I just want to kind of give a few examples of why some of these species are so hard to find. So I'm going to give about 4 or 5 examples. And number 1 on that Excel list is this one, is the Bashee river buff. It was found near the Bashee River in the Eastern Cape by a guy named James Bowker in December 1863. James Bowker actually gave a lot of his specimens that he caught to Roland Trimmen, and Trimmen then described them. And surprisingly, he found 3 females, and this was the first and the last time they were ever seen, and they are actually classified as extinct. So although it is on the list, it's probably, this species will probably not be found. But you never know, you always have to keep on looking. This is the blue tiger. It's a very common species in other parts of Africa, but it's not a common species here in South Africa. It is only an occasional visitor, and in actual fact, according to the data that we have in the LepiMAP, it was last recorded here in 1976 in the Malta Forest in Lake Galametsi Nature Reserve. And there are a few species on the list that are only occasional visitors to South Africa. So they will be hard to find, but you know, one has to keep on looking. This is a Western Cape speciality. It's called the Waihoek opal. It's one of the Chrysoritis species. They fly on the Waihoek Mountains, which is between Worcester and Ceres. According to the database, it was last recorded in January 2002. There's no photos of live specimens on the LepiMAP. And the reason I think why there's no live photos is that it's a very difficult species to get to. It flies on the highest peaks of the Waihoek Mountains, which is about 1,600 meters above sea level. And it's a tough climb to get there. I found this photo on the internet. It wasn't me who took it. And it certainly wasn't me trying to get up there, but that's kind of how it looks like to go up those mountains. And the Viog opal flies near these high peaks here at the top. So that's a tough climb. You probably have to overnight on top. There is a hut. The trail going up there is part of the UCT Mountain Club. So certainly there are expeditions going up there on a regular basis. The widow species, why are they difficult to find? They are not so difficult to find. The problem is that they cannot be distinguished from one another from a photo. So it's usually only by genital dissection that they can be distinguished from one another. So although we may have photos in the LepiMAP database of them, they can only be identified to genus level. And there's certainly areas where they do overlap. So in that case, we cannot identify them to species level. So that's probably a tricky one. There's certainly other species as well. The Leptotes species can also not be identified to species level. So these are a bit tricky. This is one that's been bugging me for ages. It's the Wineland giant cupid. We don't have any photos of this one on the LepiMAP. It has a bit of a scattered distribution, mostly here in the Western Cape and Eastern Cape. I'll show the distribution now. They fly in small localized colonies, and they can be hard to find. And I do believe that many of the old historical sites have been destroyed by agricultural activity. And that's maybe why they've become very tough to find. I know of a locality near Malmesbury, and I've been there on many occasions. And I don't know, maybe I was just unlucky, but I haven't been able to find them. This is the distribution. The yellow squares are where they have been found historically. There's no blue circles. If there was any blue circles on this map, then we would have had a photo of it. But as you can see, there's no blue circles. So we don't have any photos of it. It also flies near Port Elizabeth in the Kuga area. I know I have sent some people there to see if they can find it, but also with no luck. So maybe we will have to get some experienced help here to find the photo of these the species. This one is actually not on the Excel list, but I've put it on the presentation because there is a reason that we might not get any more photos of it in the near future. I took this photo in December 2016. It's of Orachrysops niobe. It's the Brenton cupid. It flies there in Brenton on Sea near Knysna. And the reason why it's going to be difficult to find any future photos is that the reserve where it flied was destroyed by fire probably just about 6 or 7 months after I took this photo. I think it was in June or July of 2017. So the Brenton Blue Nature Reserve was unfortunately destroyed, and since then no more specimens have been seen. So I should probably put this one on the list because we should search for new localities. Hopefully they will still be there. So that's kind of what the LepiMAP challenge is all about, is to find photos of the species that we don't have any photos on the LepiMAP, and you can find that list on the BDI website. But there's also kind of like another part that I want to speak about, because I do realize that many of the citizen scientists cannot always drive long distances. They cannot climb mountains. Not everybody always has the time and money to go and look for species that's far away. So I want to tell you that you might not know it, but there might be missing species in your own backyard. And I want to show you how you can use the LepiMAP to see if there's any missing species in your own backyard. So the LepiMAP has a map function which actually shows the coverage of places in South Africa where people have looked for butterflies and found them. So the yellow squares, again, those are the historical records, and then the blue circles is where we have photo records of. So if you go, and you can find this map if you click on maps on the left-hand side. If you're in the virtual museum, click on coverage. I usually select the RSA old map because that's the one I prefer, and then you just click on the request summary if you did that. And if you then hover over any of the yellow squares or the blue circles, it will, and you click on it, it will actually take you to that specific area. And I want to show you what you're then going to see. I'm going to give two examples. It's here in the area that I'm living, which is Cape Town. So I'm going to click on this circle here, which is part of the Cape Peninsula. And if you click on it, you're going to see this map. So this is a 1/4 degree square of that specific area. For those of you that don't know Cape Town very well, the Cape Town itself just sits a little bit north of here. It's Table Mountain. This is kind of like the back end of Table Mountain here at the top. And then you've got the southern suburbs of Cape Town sitting here. Les and myself stays in this area. You have Hout Bay in this area, and then Kommetjie and Fish Hoek. All the flat areas are obviously very populated and lots of suburbs here. All the green areas are nature reserves, so they are fairly well preserved, even though you have all these suburbs on its sides. This also,
so wherever you are living in the world,
this also forms part of the Cape, the Table Mountain Nature Reserve. So Simonstown, and then the area ends just before the entrance to the Cape Point Nature Reserve. Okay, so that is what you will see. And if you scroll a bit further down, you will get a list of all the species that has been recorded in that specific area. I've just pasted a small section of that. You will see that for that sector, there's 104 species. That obviously includes the moth species. And then I've just pasted a little section here of some of the Lysenidae of that area that has been recorded. And the thing that I want to show you here is that on the right-hand side, you will see what is known as the last recorded date. So that is the last time that that species has been recorded in that specific area. So you can see for the water geranium bronze, there was a record in August 2020, which was just a month or so ago. For the bush bronze, there was one in July. The common geranium bronze, there was one in April. I assume that this must have been a record from a garden, as we were in lockdown at that stage. But I want to highlight two specific records here. And that is the ones that I would call the missing species. And those are the missing species for this specific sector. And that's why I'm saying that even if you can't drive long distances or want to spend a lot of money, you know, finding butterflies, you can go and look very close to you to see if you can't refresh some of these very old dates. So there's two species that hasn't been recorded in this sector for quite some time. There is a burnished opal that's last been recorded in 1994, and then a dark opal in 1957. So I just want to talk a bit about those two species. Just in general for this sector, I've summarized the number of species recorded here. Historically, it's 65 species, and 8 have not been recorded since the year 2000. So that's 12.31%. So those are the 8 species that I want citizen science to go and look for. So let's just have a look at the two species. This is the dark opal. It's an absolutely gorgeous butterfly. I took these photos. The left one, that's a male. I took this photo in McGregor. They obviously still fly in other parts of the country. It's not part of the there's not, they're not in any danger of disappearing at the moment. But in sector 3418AB, they certainly haven't been seen since 1957. And then the right-hand side, that's the underside, and that I took on a farm near, I think it was a farm near Burnished that I took this photo. So if you think about the fact that it hasn't been recorded since 1957, then the odds are pretty small that it is probably still flying on the Cape Peninsula. And the reason why it has disappeared there is mainly because of infrequent fires, or too frequent fires, mainly because of human activity on the peninsula. And that's probably why they've disappeared. The burnished opal, this one has bugged me also for some time in this sector, because I know they are still there, and I am determined to get a photo. So whenever I don't have the time or the money to drive too far, the peninsula is only about 15 or 20 minutes drive for me. So whenever I have time, then I go there, and it's my mission to find a photo of the burnished opal there. I'm sure they must still be flying there. This is another sector. It is just to the east of Cape Town. You can see from this photo that it's a very populated area. It contains some of the southern suburbs of Cape Town still. And then here you have the northern suburbs of Cape Town, and also the west coast suburbs of Cape Town. That is Table Bay that just starts there. Now, if you look at this area, you can see that there's not much left, and you would think that most butterfly species here would have disappeared. So if you look at that sector, then historically 53 species have been recorded here, and 16 have not been recorded since the year 2000. So the heavily human impact on this area is certainly very significant, that almost a third of all the species have not been seen since the year 2000. Now, even though so some of those species includes a very common one actually in the Western Cape. It's the red russet. In most other areas around Cape Town, they are very common, and you can still find them there. But strangely enough, for that sector, it hasn't been recorded since 1965. So is it still there? I will show you now what I think, and if there's still a possibility of finding it. This is the distribution map of the red russet, and you can see that it's endemic to South Africa, and it's mostly endemic to the Western Cape. There's a few records in the Northern Cape as well. And you can see that this little sector here, that's the one that I was looking at now. You can see there's no blue circle, so no photo has been taken. There's no photo of it from that sector on the LepiMAP. But you can also see that there's a lot of other places where there's no photo of it. And that's also what I want citizen scientists to do, is we need to go out and look at where this species have been recorded in on the historical data. And we need blue circles in these yellow squares. So that is my challenge to citizen science. Another species from that sector, it was a subspecies of Lepidochrysops methymna, the monkey giant cupid. This is the nominate species, the photos I have. The subspecies actually disappeared around 1950. The Tygerberg area, or that sector there, was the only one where they were ever recorded. So unfortunately, I think there's little or no chance that they will ever be rediscovered again. This is a female. The female nominate species has this blue markings. And in the subspecies that flew on tigerbird, also, the male also had the blue markings, whereas the male in the nominate species doesn't have the blue markings. Interestingly, there's a very small nature reserve in that sector, which is part of the University of Western Cape. It's on their grounds. It's a very small reserve. It takes you about 10 or 15 minutes to walk from one end to another. And yet, in that reserve, you still find this little guy there. It's Kedestis lenis. It's actually classified as vulnerable. The UWC Nature Reserve location or locality is only one of two where they are still can be found. So even in a very heavily populated area like that, you still have small little reserves which actually harbor still some interesting species. I've just changed the map to the actual, the view of how it looks like, that sector. And you can see how heavily populated the area is. Now, if you look here in the northern parts, that's where I think that we can still find some of the missing species. The lighter colored areas are actually agricultural fields, so there's not much to look for there. This area here to the left of the N7 is actually heavily overgrown with invasive species, so there's not much to look there. But there's a hill here. I'm just going to zoom into that area. This little hill here, which is part of the Merendal wine estate, still has some natural vegetation on, which I think could still harbor some of the missing species. It actually runs into a ridge onto another farm. And then there's also some natural vegetation here. I think this is the Durbanville Hills wine estate, which still has some natural vegetation on it. So apart from, so I think that even though this area, has been severely impacted by humans, there are still some spots where one can go and look and see if one can find some of the missing species in this sector. So that is kind of my story. If there's any questions, then I'll be happy to answer.
Thanks very much, Fanie. I think it's fantastic to have some perspective on LepiMAP, and particularly the need to refresh older records. Yeah. And I think it's a wonderful challenge to us citizen scientists in the different areas where we live to go out and try and fill those gaps. Change the yellow, well, not change, but add the turquoise spots to the circles to the yellow squares.
Exactly, yes.
Fanie did say questions, but I'm